Hi, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really happy to have you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We are really going to be talking today about what the normal parts are when it comes to picky eating, because I'm sure you've heard people say that it's really normal to have a picky eater and this is nothing you should be concerned about. And there are some times where that might be true and sometimes where that might be false. So I'm here today to kind of bring light and explain the difference between what's normal and when you should be concerned, right? Because if you are in this where you're struggling and you're stressed out and you're here seeking help, right? You're probably wondering, will they grow out of it? Is this normal, right? So those are all great questions to ask. The issue is sometimes you can easily get advice that really doesn't pertain to your child, especially if you're asking friends, family members, people on the internet and Facebook groups, right? They're going to give you their experience, and their experience might not be what you and your child are experiencing. So that advice may not be relevant at all to you. The other issue is sometimes this advice will come from your family pediatrician. And, oftentimes we'll hear from parents that, their doctor has been telling them for years that their kid, there's nothing wrong with them, they're gaining weight, there's no problem, right? Well, year after year, they're expecting their child to grow out of it and they haven't, right? And, so why does that happen? Why do doctors say, that it's really normal, everything seems fine, when maybe there isn't, right? And usually it just comes down to their experiences and their schooling. Their schooling doesn't really talk about these different aspects of feeding in the ways that a feeding therapist will do. Like our training is like very specific, right? I always talk about this, right? I learned all about the gut, the sensory system, the mechanics of eating, different aspects of diet, nutrition, gut. I look into medications. Right? There's all these different pieces of this puzzle that make it up. And just looking at purely one aspect, like weight gain, as your measure of if everything is going well and normal is not always the full picture, right? Sometimes we hear that, well, they're gaining weight, so I'm not concerned. But, well, what about all the nutrients they're missing? Or what about, are they actually able to chew the foods properly? Those are things that they're not looking at, assessing or thinking. And that's not every doctor. That's not to say every pediatrician will do that same thing or give you that same line. It's just something that we've heard a lot, like a lot. So let's start to understand, what is picky eating and how many kids does this even affect? Right? So research shows that 20 to 30% of kids will struggle with some type of feeding challenge or picky eating within their first 5 to 6 years of life, right? So only about 1/3 to a half of these children, though, will actually outgrow their feeding difficulties without intervention. And from my anecdotal personal experience, running a feeding clinic, um, my experience is that less and less of kids are able to outgrow their feeding difficulties. I personally feel like there are more factors influencing their feeding issues than before. And I think the combination of several different factors affecting feeding is a lot harder to outgrow or overcome than perhaps it was even 20 years prior, right? So, long term, about 50% of children with picky eating challenges continue to struggle with not eating a wide enough range of foods. And this goes into, their elementary grade school years and beyond. I know many adults who are very, very picky, and perhaps you're one of them, and you're listening to this, as an adult, trying to figure out why you're picky as an adult. We've had that as well. And I will tell you, fixing this as an adult is easier when you have the motivation, right? Because sometimes an adult or even a teenager who really wants to enact changes, they're definitely going to put more effort in. They're going to try a little harder, and they're going to make an effort to understand and learn about what they're experiencing versus a small child who literally just wants to go and play and wants to be left alone, and they just want to eat what they want to eat, right? They don't understand health implications or social implications even right away, right? It might take them a few years to make that connection that, oh, socially, this isn't what everybody else is doing and eating, right? So it does, I find it affecting more and more kids as the years go on. So, these numbers definitely were from a few years ago. This was from when I took the SOS course initially. So these numbers, this is definitely outdated, probably by a few years. I don't know if anyone has done a more recent study, but that was even just a few years ago. So I imagine, and like I said, personally, I've seen, I believe, an increase in this. Just, the number of calls that we get and literally the severity of the kids that are coming to us. Sometimes, we're getting kids that literally only have one or two foods left in their diet, which is definitely not considered picky anymore. And let's, get into that right now. So the characteristics of like a typical, like developmentally appropriate picky eater, what does that look like? So there are periods of your child's development where they are going to be a little bit more selective about what foods they choose to eat. And this has something to do with as they're developing and, they're going through periods where they want a little bit more control. So with that desire for more control comes controlling things like food. So this will actually happen, at 3 different ages. It's going to happen when they're a toddler first, between 2 and 3. It's going to happen when they're in, basically in kindergarten age to first grade, that 5 to 6 year range. And again, when they're 11 to 12. So those are some normal ages where you might see kids start to be a little bit more selective. But within that, there is still a range of normal, right? So even if they're being more selective about the types of foods, they are still going to be able to accept a variety of foods, and they should be accepting foods from all different food groups, right? And that's not to say that if you're a vegan that they have to be accepting meats. It's to say that they're eating from all the same food groups that everyone else in the household is eating as well. They're not afraid. There should not be that fear, that very serious emotional reaction that sometimes we do see when kids are really struggling with food. So, they're not afraid of food. It's just they're being selective. They're saying, like, this is what I want. I know what I want, and I know I don't want that, right? But that fear should not be there. So again, normal picky eating, they're still accepting a variety of foods. They're still they're not afraid of the foods. It's not about that. And usually with a little bit of encouragement, they can try new foods, right? It's not like if you encourage them, they freak out or they run away or they cry or they have a tantrum, right? There isn't like that, or that flat out, absolutely not refusal. Usually they're a little bit more flexible. It has more to do with these stages of, like wanting to, exert their independence, about, taking control over their lives and things along that line. It's not things like spitting food out. They can't handle the foods, gagging on foods, throwing up when they look at foods. Like that is not part of the normal development of those picky eater stages, right? And they definitely are eating at least a healthy variety, again, of foods. It's not like they only have 3, 4, 5, even 10 foods is a very small number of foods. They definitely have more than that within their repertoire of foods that they're willing to go with, right? So we sort of compared and contrasted a little bit what's normal, what's not. And you might have heard the term problem feeder. And that's a term, at least that's a term that I had learned when I took the SOS training with Dr. Toomey, who I want to say is like the grandmother of, of feeding therapy in that world. But, problem feeders, they're eating less than 20 foods. They are refusing entire categories of foods like vegetables or meats very commonly. They're definitely distressed during meal times. It's not a fun environment for them to be in. Oftentimes, they're either rushing through the meal, shoving food in their mouth, and leaving the table as fast as possible, or meal times are taking an extremely long period of time, very often into over an hour to complete their meal. Um, and just exposing them to new foods alone is not working at all, right? So those are our problem feeders, right? Versus our picky eaters. Like they might accept a variety, they'll eat foods from all food groups, and they'll gradually increase the variety of foods that they're accepting, right? Problem feeders, they start decreasing and eliminating foods from their diet, and they do not bring them back usually, right? So that's how you know that there's a problem versus, okay, this is just a developmental period. And again, those age groups, those 3 age groups, 2 to 3, right? Toddler years, 5 to 6, and 11 to 12. And a lot of times I hear parents say that they'll enter in during that toddlerhood year, but they don't leave it, right? They are not leaving it behind. So it's like, okay, well, they've been picky from 1 and now they're 6. That's just too long of a time. That's not a developmental period that, kind of like ebbs and flows. That's really a continuous, constant problem, right? So when do you seek help? I would say immediately when you start to notice some of those red flags, when you start to see that they're eliminating foods. You do not want to be in a situation where your child has less than 10 foods. And the parents that come to see us, when their kids have a better handful of foods, make progress much faster. Therapy is shorter. Everything is much easier, quicker, versus when we have 1 or 2 foods to start with as their preferred foods, their only foods that they're eating. And that absolutely does happen. I am not exaggerating. When we only have one or 2 foods, that is very limited for us, right? It's very limited for us to even help you chain anything to that because, well, they're very limited. They have one texture, probably, right? One color, one flavor, that it's just not a lot to work with. So the more we have to work with, the easier and the faster, the less time in therapy versus waiting and waiting and waiting and hoping that it'll get better. And you just keep seeing the foods drop off of their list of safe foods. That just makes therapy take longer. And right, that's more expensive. It's more time. It's more stress on everybody. And it's less nutrition, right? Overall that they're getting. So I always say early intervention is always best. There's never been a time where someone said, oh, actually, in this case, early intervention is not a good idea. I don't think I've ever heard that. Early intervention is usually best practice for most things, right? So whenever you see some of those signs, that's a good time to, start to seek help from a professional, right? And you want to, right? So last episode, we talked about what is a holistic feeding therapist, right? Of course, I would suggest someone who is more holistic and who is going to look at the whole child and the nutrition that they're taking in, their sensory system, their oral motor system, their digestive system. Are we looking at the whole child, the whole picture? Because we want to make sure that we're actually working on the issues that are causing the feeding to be disrupted, right? So like I said in last week's episode, if you are doing behavioral therapy for a child who has sensory issues and oral motor issues, it is just not going to make a dent. And a lot of times that's what happens. Parents come to us after doing therapy for over a year without seeing any progress. And oftentimes it's because some of those other puzzle pieces had been completely ignored and they weren't being worked on, they weren't being targeted, they weren't even being, brought up or addressed. And sometimes that's just the provider's experience. Unfortunately, there is no degree in feeding therapy, right? Feeding therapists traditionally, if you talk to people, it's a speech pathologist or an occupational therapist who has done some sort of continuing education in this field or topic. But there is no degree, there's no test that you pass, right? It is totally based 100% on the provider or therapist's own training. And parents don't know always to ask these questions to understand exactly, well, what kind of a feeding therapist are you? Or what's your belief in this? And what's your experience? And what's your background? And it's just something that we don't know. We see their website, a sign that says this is what we do, and you just assume that they have the experience to cover all those bases. But that is not always the case. And that is absolutely true, even if you go to the hospital level. Just because there's a hospital that does feeding therapy does not mean that that provider has all of the training in all of those different areas. So parents that understand and who are vocal and ask questions, those are the parents who are going to find a provider that's going to get them the best results, right? And of course, we have support here, and our online parent course is literally meant to help and coach you and teach you exactly how to get your kids to like food, because just dropping your child off, as and not learning and not absorbing and not following out those suggestions on a daily basis, even small steps on a daily basis, is just not going to, you're not going to see that progress and success that you're hoping for. And, I have said this so openly so many times, but the parents who make the most progress are the learners. They're the ones that want to learn, that want to see the progress. They're super motivated and they take the time to learn and implement those strategies that we teach. Those parents see the fastest progress because they are in it, they are doing it, and they're taking that ownership, right? Because if you don't know what it is that you could be doing differently, how can you change it so that each mealtime at home is a little bit better? And remember, it's not big leaps and bounds, it's little baby steps. And each of those baby steps will compound into a lot of great progress, right? So it's all about, are you getting the right education in what your child's issues actually are? Are you finding a provider that really can work directly with your child's specific needs, right? So these are things to consider when you're thinking about intervention, right? So, of course, I'm going to offer you some practical tips, right? So if you are listening to this and you're thinking, my child is definitely not falling into the typical picky eater. There's something more going on here, but I don't even have anyone around here. I have no idea where to start, where to bring them. Of course, I would recommend that our quiz. It's 2 minutes. It will tell you what level your child is at. And there's a free class that follows that explains the process and how we teach you exactly how to get your kids to start liking food and enjoying food, right? With our Unlocking Mealtimes program. right? So you can get more help, more support there, of course, right? But if you want to start taking just a few steps today, one thing we always hear, even online, is that encouraging variety, putting different foods out on the plate. That will help expose them to new foods, new colors, new smells, new flavors. But this, and I can't stress this enough, all of the things I'm going to suggest here in isolation are not going to do anything on their own, right? If your child is developmentally just a little bit of a picky eater, these tips are going to be fantastic for you. They're really going to make a difference and they're going to work really well. But if your child has other things going on, just working on this might be a tip that you shouldn't even be working on for a while, right? Like this is something I wouldn't even suggest for a child who is at like one or two foods, right? Because that might just send them into like a tizzy. They're going to freak out if you put a new food in front of them and it's not going to be good, right? So sorry, I keep going back to like my course because I really love it so much. But that's why we specifically give you lessons that are going to be relevant to where your child is currently at because of this reason. Because I don't want you working on things or trying strategies that are going to backfire on you, like things that they're not ready for yet, right? So that's why I structured the program the way that I did. But in general, for typical picky eaters, right? Or kids who are not as severe, just putting out different foods on their plate is a great way to go, right? You want to, tip number 2, you want to create a positive mealtime experience. So, this could be even just clearing clutter from the table or telling a few jokes at dinner or putting some music on in the background while you're eating dinner or eating whatever meal. But you want to start doing things that will associate meal times with a positive instead of a negative, because a lot of our picky eaters don't have a good view of mealtime. So our job is to start changing that slowly but surely. Okay. Number 3, parent mindset is so important. I wrote the whole book on it called Mealtime Mindset, and it's all about getting our parent minds to sort of get behind this movement of like, okay, we are going to make progress. There's some different things we can say in our wording, some different things we can do in our environment, just some little changes that we can use to our advantage to start to flip our mindset towards food as being this is like the worst time of day to this is going to be the best time of the day, right? We want to start making those incremental changes in our mind as well so that we can do that in our child's mind as well. Okay. We also want to start working through the subliminals, through their subconscious brain, right? So we offer something called our Picky Eater subliminal audio downloads, right? So we actually have a mini course in it for $20 on our website under our resources. And this is something where you could put on music in the background or while your child is sleeping, and having their brain being able to hear and absorb some of those awesome affirmations about food in a very positive way can help sort of unravel some of that that wall that kids have built up around food as a bad, scary, or negative thing. Now, again, that alone with no other strategies implemented, you're probably not going to see much success. So all of these work better when they're intertwined and interconnected and they're all sort of working together, right? There's a lot of different things we can do that are on all of those 4 pillars of feeding: the gut, the mindset, the oral motor. Okay. There's a lot of different things, even within just even those 3, that are going to be really key. We want to make sure that their sensory system's working great, that their oral motor skills are great. And each of these tips is going to be very individualized for what your child needs, right? So always take tips on feeding with a grain of salt, right? If it's not specifically tailored to your child, because Just even me giving a general tip, we don't know exactly what level your child is at and what their sensory profile is and what their oral motor skills are and what their gut and digestive story is. And all of those things are going to affect which of the strategies that you're going to want to implement to see the fastest success. So if this is, something that you really want to dive deeper with and you really want our support with, that's why I created the program. It's really to help parents who have some significant challenges around feeding with their kids. So please jump in, get started today. You can go to the pickyeaterstest.com to get started and learn more. And I hope to see you on the inside. I love chatting with our parents that join our program and seeing all of their successes. So please join us in there, and we will see you again next week. But if you have any questions about this, not about your child specifically, but any questions about anything I might have said today, be sure to hop over to Instagram or on YouTube, and you can message and I will respond there and answer any questions that you may have. All right, so I will see you next week. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you guys have a great week with lots of happy, joyful meal times. Have a good week.
Thank you for listening to How to Unpicky Your Picky Eater. To learn more about achieving your child's feeding goals, check out Christine's website at foodologyfeeding.com. And be sure to tune in next time to How to Unpicky Your Picky Eater.